just to see if we've got Jeff's view on the table, you know, leave my criticisms aside. So McMahan, other things being equal, increasing the number of people participating in the imposition of an unjust threat, all else held equal, that can reduce the amount of harm that it's permissible to inflict in self-defense against the aggressors or threateners. Increasing the number of aggressors can render the defensive response disproportionate and so impermissible. This can be so even setting aside harms the defense effort might impose on third parties or innocent bystanders or something, right? So you might think, how can this be? I mean, you know, I'm going to carry out an attack, but if I just take care to bring a whole lot of friends along with me participating, and the number of aggressors goes out, that affects, you know, whether it's okay to have self-defensive response. So it can seem puzzling and crazy, and there are views that would say it is. But I'm just going to say I just agree with Jeff about this. So the background here for Jeff is, for McMahan, there can be a liability justification for infliction of defensive violence. So there's two kinds of justifications that can come into play here. The person is responsible for wrongfully imposing an unjust threat of sufficient magnitude to warrant a killing response. That person is liable to be killed, and that's a sufficient justification. The killing doesn't wrong her. There can be another type of justification for infliction of defensive violence. The harm inflicted is, all things considered, according to the proper moral accounting, a lesser evil than the harm being averted, when we've morally discounted the harms and benefits to various people appropriately. There's a lesser evil justification. And these two types of justification can be combined. Note also here for McMahan, liability can vary by degree. So McMahan gives, in his paper, describes some ways in which this comes up and how we might respond when the harm to which one is liable is less than death. But then he thinks the really puzzling cases, and I'm going to skip to that, are the cases in which it's plausible to hold that in some cases, he went over some of these in the paper, infliction of defensive violence to avert or reduce a wrongful threat would be disproportionate, even though each aggressor or threatener regarded separately is imposing a harm that's greater than the harm of normal death. So there's a bunch of aggressors participating, or threateners, you know, threatening harm. Each one taken individually is, you know, responsible for an amount of wrongful harm sufficient to make you liable to be killed. And according to the position on liability to be killed that McMahan espouses, a responsible agent who's minimally responsible for imposing an unjust threat of death can be liable to be killed. But simply adding further aggressors or threateners to the case, each responsible for wrongful harm of sufficient magnitude to trigger liability to be killed, cannot bring it about that liability to be killed is extinguished. So how can we get the result then that just by increasing the number of aggressors in this sort of case, we nonetheless can get a case where self-defensive violence is infliction, given that the total amount of unjust harm, wrong that you avert, which is just saving one innocent life, isn't sufficient to make it proportionate to kill that many people, right? To kill that many aggressors. So Jeff's example. He raises this issue in his paper initially in the context of his own theory about responsibility and what makes you liable, but the problem is more general, would hold even if you had a pure culpability view of what can trigger liability. All right. So for example, here's a culpability example. Jeff gave this. A large number of minimally culpable aggressors are wrongfully attacking you. Each in turn enters your doorway and seeks to kill you. So you can kill one as he enters the doorway, you can kill the second, you can kill the third, up to 10, up to 100, up to 1,000, up to 1 billion. Your sword doesn't get rusty. And you must kill each and every aggressor to save your life. McMahan's judgment is that the number of, now these are minimally culpable aggressors. They think they're prosecuting a just war, but they're making a mistake, but it's a slightly culpable mistake. So these are minimally culpable aggressors. McMahon's judgment is that if the number of aggressors becomes large enough, you lack a justification for killing in self-defense, even though each is sufficiently responsible for imposing a sufficiently large unjust harm that each one is liable to be killed. So there's a sufficient liability justification. So we've got a compelling justification that you may kill each one in self-defense, and a compelling justification that no, you may not. And Jeff inclines to the second, but he's not, I mean, he tries out various ways of coming to this result, and he's not clear that any of them really work. So there's left as a sort of conundrum. So the first way is, the first response is, nope, each one is liable, kill them all and let God sort them out. You may kill any number, 1 million, 1 billion, 10 billion, as long, ignoring harm to third parties like innocent family members. But each one, taken one by one, is liable to be killed. They're minimally culpable, but they are culpable, so kill them. The second response is no. If the numbers add up too great, you may not kill them all. And if you may not kill them all, since you're not going to, it's futile to kill just a few. You don't save your life unless you kill them all. So if you may not kill them all, you may not kill any. So that's the second line. So I just think it's a beautiful puzzle. I mean, it's beautiful. It's Kandinsky. Okay. So McMahan suggests some possible justifications of the judgment in this type of case. The number of aggressors can increase and render infliction of defensive violence disproportionate and hence impermissible, but he thinks these have problems. One can escape the conundrum by giving up some claim. So there are two arguments here. The first argument and the second argument. One can escape the conundrum by giving up some claim that's necessary for the soundness or one or the other of the two compelling arguments. And I take it we have to do that, right? We want consistency. As McMahan acknowledges, some will reject the second compelling argument on the ground that it's a mistake to aggregate the separate attacks and consider the total amount of wrongful harm reverted in relation to the total of harm that must be inflicted on aggressors to gain that amount of wrongful harm avoidance. I take it Francis Cam takes this line for this sort of case. Instead, one must treat each attack as though it was a separate situation to be assessed on its own. But you may ask me, well, why think this? Consider two wrongful attacks on an individual. They look exactly identical, except that the first is not followed by similar further attacks, so that by killing one aggressor, one can save one's own life. Whereas the second, otherwise identical, is followed immediately by a string of similar attacks, one after another. So there's a difference here. Here, killing the first assailant saves one's life only if one also kills all the rest of the assailants. So that seems to be has to be a relevant difference. It may make a moral difference to what it's permissible to do, but this, of course, this is one of these examples where one person's reductio, as my old mentor Brian Barry used to say, one person's reductio is another's QED, right? They've got the same premises and they're just running the inference in different directions. So here's a suggested response. Let's try giving up the first allegedly compelling argument. So I want to stick with the second. Here's one way. Give up the idea that one of the things that generated the puzzle was this idea of a sufficient liability justification. Give that up. There's no such thing as a liability justification for the infliction of defensive violence. What McMahan calls liability to killed is never sufficient for justified deployment. Being a responsible agent, non-crazy, non-demented, and so on, who's responsible for imposing an unjust threat of harm on a person, who's done nothing to deserve this imposition or to forfeit her normal rights not to be killed, that's a factor. Yeah, it's relevant. That's a factor that may affect whether the person threatened or someone acting on her behalf may permissibly respond with lethal violence. It's a factor, but other factors also matter. The various factors may interact in complicated ways. What we want to know is whether, all things considered, in the types of situations we're considering, it's morally forbidden, permitted, or mandatory to deploy lethal defensive violence. We seek a formula in which all these relevant moral factors are assigned proper moral weights. So given the facts, the formula determines what one may, must, or must not do. In this discussion, we're simply trying to become clear about what the factors are and what the qualitative shape, what the structure of their interactions, what the structure of the formula is. Ultimately, we have to assign numerical values, of course. So comment. Even if you become what McMahan calls liable to be killed, I don't think it follows that killing you can't be wronging you. I mean, you might say, look, each person is an agent with dignity and moral worth, And forfeiture of rights is always partial and contextual. So even if I'm a culpable aggressor, but killing me would be just futile, do no good, avert no wrongful injustice, do no other good. If it's completely futile, that wrongs me, even if I'm a culpable aggressor, I think. So forfeiture of rights, that's loose. Forfeiture of rights, it's not like you completely give up your rights, no matter what, So, comment. McMahan introduces an interesting example. This came out in his remarks. He stated this. Responses to which may clarify the nature of the various positions that one might take in response to McMahon's puzzle. Suppose that a very large number of villainous, evil aggressors, not minimally culpable aggressors, attacks you. Each enters your doorway in turn. You must kill each attacker in turn as she crosses the doorway in order to save your life. Somehow these became she's as they became villains. Gender-neutral pronouns here. You have not done anything to deserve this treatment. I'm the victim. Nor have you done anything to forfeit your rights that the attackers are violating. McMahan doubts that in this case, increasing the number of aggressors can bring it about that infliction of defensive violence against the villainous attackers is morally impermissible, all things considered. But notice that one relevant moral factor, what amount of harm must be inflicted on aggressors or threateners in order to achieve a given amount of reduction of unjustly threatened harm, does change as the number of aggressors enter the doorway increases. We're getting the same amount of unjust harm reduction, but the number of aggressors we have to kill keeps going up and up. Suppose there are 1 billion of them. One might hold, I myself would hold, the setting aside any indirect harms that killing the aggressors might impose on bystanders, so just thinking of the simple case, considering only harms inflicted on wrongful aggressors, there's some maybe very large number of villainous aggressors carrying out the attacks such that the infliction of the defensive violence would be disproportionate. The total unjust harm averted, one life saved, it's just too small, it's small potatoes, in relation to the amount of heavily discounted harm that must be inflicted on wrongdoers. All right, so here's a suggestion as to what underlies the issue. The underlying issue, I think, is aggregation. Any factor that's relevant in determining what it's morally acceptable to do, all things considered, if you increase that factor to great enough magnitude while holding other factors constant, can bring about a change in what it's morally acceptable to do, all things considered. So everything trades off against everything else. In other words, there are no lexical priorities or absolutely unyielding thresholds in the correct deontological morality of self-defense in war. Sometimes confusedly people think of this as a consequentialism versus non-consequentialism issue, but that's completely orthogonal. You can be a consequentialist and accept no aggregation of lexical priorities. You can be a non-consequentialist and accept aggregation. Independently of whether you should be a consequentialist or a non-consequentialist, we should all uncontroversially accept aggregation, I think. Not everybody agrees with me on this, but I think it's a great credit that Jeff's paper, raises this aggregation issue. Comment. McMahan introduces the puzzle in conjunction with examples drawn from his own particular view of what renders you liable to be killed by defensive violence. His view is that you don't have to be culpable at all. If you're a responsible agent, you're responsible for imposing a risk of harm or certainty of unjust harm sufficient to warrant killing, you're liable to be killed. One becomes responsible, in McMahan, for such an unjust threat if one undertakes a course of action that has as a foreseeable consequence the imposition of unjust harm. As in his example of the driver who is driving conscientiously but skids and is then becoming a threat, posing a threat of death as the car skids to a pedestrian. And then we can imagine the numbers. There's 10. Coming at you is 10 skidding cars, 100, 1,000, a billion. You just raise the number of threateners, and it seems to me the numbers have to count here. I mean, it can't be the case that you can kill any number. I mean, even if I don't go along with Jeff's view about responsibility in this case, but even if you did, even if you thought, so even if you went along with liability, surely the numbers have to count. But there's a suggestion here. Again, we're seeking a plausible way to give up the first compelling argument so we can get out of the puzzle. That together with the second compelling argument generated the puzzle that man finds troubling. So here's a simple way. let's suppose that the factors, this vast simplification, I can't defend this, I'm just going to throw this out in conclusion. Suppose the factors relevant to whether one may permissibly employ defensive violence are these. A wrongful threat is imposed by someone's behavior. So the question arises whether it's permissible to kill when it's necessary to save the life of the victim. Various individuals involved might be morally culpable or blameworthy with respect to the situation. If so, their culpability is a consideration that favors killing the culpable rather than the non-culpable when necessary to avert wrongful harm. Culpability varies by degree. I think it doesn't just vary between 0 and 1. You can get a lot of culpability. And third, the deployment of defensive violence might bring about greater or lesser amount of reduction of wrongful harm. The greater the gain in reduction of wrongful harm the defensive violence would bring about, the easier it is to justify that deployment of defensive violence. Defensive violence might bring about other goods. These might be relevant to lesser degree. 4, the deployment of defensive violence might bring about greater or lesser harm to aggressors or threateners of wrongful harm. The harms to these individuals may be discounted to a greater or lesser extent, though never completely, depending on their degree of culpability. You never completely discount a harm. A candidate deployment of defensive violence will be morally acceptable only if proportionate, where proportionality depends on the ratio of the amount of appropriately morally discounted harm reduction, unjust harm reduction, and other benefits the deployment would bring about, the ratio of that to the amount of appropriately morally discounted harm to those attacked, and along with other evils discounted. And the numerator and the denominator here both have to be positive in sign for this ratio analysis to be directly applicable, otherwise you get weirdness. And the proportionality judge will distinguish and give different weights to intentional, unintentional wrongdoing, and so on. So this is just the barest sketch of it, but the idea is it's really, it's culpability and it's of everybody involved in the situation. And what amount of gain in terms of averting wrongful harm can I bring about by self-defensive action? Those are the relevant things. How much harm I would actually cause, that's not really relevant, except insofar as it affects, as it affects culpability, which it will in some cases. But in any event, that's one way of getting out of the puzzle. You may not like it. It's really not a view. It's just a sketch of a view. So I can't say that a hint of a sketch of a view doesn't amount to an argument. We can't say McMahon's puzzles are solved. His clear delineation of the puzzle is a significant contribution to the morality of self-defense and of war. So we should be thankful and grateful. And I should just say, the enterprise here is trying to work out the most defensible version of deontology or non-consequentialism that we can devise as it applies to our domain of concern. The big question, whether any version of non-consequentialism or deontology is correct or some version of consequentialism is superior, that's just left for another occasion. But if these puzzles that trouble McMahon prove to be intractable, we just get in, they can't be solved, that would be grist for the consequentialist mill. But it's premature. We don't know. We need to think about it.